Hi, it's Penny here, and in this video what I wanted to do is share with you some hidden gems from my bookshelves. So pretty much all the books on my bookshelves are books that I would count as my favorites. But what I've done is go through, and for each of the books on my shelves, I've had a look at how many ratings the book has on Goodreads. And I've pulled out ones that have fewer than 5,000 ratings. I think the lowest only has 18 ratings. So I picked out the one with the lowest number of ratings, and then also ones where the average rating is over 4 stars. So these are books that not only have I loved them, but also the average opinion is that they're really great books. So I've got 8 books or book series on this list. I'm going to start with the ones with the lowest rating working up to the highest. So firstly, we have the Beldame Apocrypha series by Cameron Hurley. Now, admittedly, the first book in the series has slightly over 5,000 ratings and only an average rating of 3.67, which is why probably a lot of people didn't continue on. The second book only has less than 2,000 ratings, but the average rating is 4.02. And then finally, the last book only has 1,400 ratings, and the average rating is 4.05. So in this series, we follow Nyx, who is a bounty hunter it's kind of a sci-fi fantasy series with bug-based science. To be honest, this is a series where I really do need to give it a reread, but Nyx basically gets involved in some political shenanigans that are going on, a bit of a political conspiracy, and she has to, for that reason, get a crew together for a bounty hunting mission. And the crew that she gets together, I really love them. And just Nyx is such a badass bitch. I love her, but the world is really interesting too, and I love the bug science. Like, I just really enjoyed this series, and I feel like it's so emotional in parts. I can't wait to reread this at some point. Next, I have specifically the second Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever. I do also have on my shelves the first Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever, but this series has had a lot more people read it. Actually, this only fits in the under 5,000 category because I'm counting the bind-ups specifically. The individual books do have more, like 20,000 reviews, but also I hardly ever see anybody talk about this series, and I really feel like if you like Lord of the Rings, you should be looking into this series. It's a portal fantasy series. We're following this man who has leprosy. I think it's set in the 80s. Yeah, the first Chronicles were published in the 70s and these ones were published in the 80s. So we have this man who's got leprosy, and also I think his wife has died. He's a miserable old man, very unhappy, and then he ends up going through this portal into this magical world. He doesn't believe that he's gone through into a magical world though, which is why he's called Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever. Because when he gets to this magical world, it turns out that there's this whole prophecy that a man is going to arrive in the way he's arrived, and that they're going to take on this dark lord that's causing a lot of problems in the land. And of course, he doesn't believe any of this. He thinks it's a dream. So he's kind of going along with the dream, just having a good time, but then some things about the world are really not good time things, and he starts questioning it, but also through, I think, the whole series, he's like, no, but it's probably just a dream. But the world building is amazing. There's giants and just all sorts of weird creatures and like weird landscapes that they have to travel through. The only thing I always feel like I need to warn people about for this series is at the beginning of the first Chronicles, because he thinks it's a dream, he does end up raping this young girl. Not the best. He does, though, then spend the rest of the book series kind of trying to make up for that and realizing like how wrong that was, even if he does think it's a dream. So it's something he struggles with a lot, which is at least something. But honestly, this is another series where I will definitely reread it in the future, and probably many times. Okay, then we have The Dark Vault by Victoria Schwab. Admittedly, this is another one where this is a bind-up, and the bind-up only has 3,500 ratings, whereas the actual individual books have a lot more ratings, but the average rating for the bind-up is much higher, so I think it's the way to go about reading this series. So actually, there's only 2 books bound up in this series. Victoria Schwab has said that she's plotted out the 3rd book, but it's kind of an unknown as to whether it will ever actually be released. So in this series, we're following this young girl whose job is to defend and protect the doorways into this like archive of the dead, and lately some of the dead have been escaping escaping. She basically got this role. It's like a traditional role that her family takes, and she's able to visit like her grandfather who gave her this position. And the story does deal a lot with like the grief of her having lost her grandfather, but still I guess the ways that she can be connected to him. So it's a really lovely story, and I really like the way that Victoria Schwab dealt with this Library of the Dead and the way she developed it. It is a YA series, but I think if you like Victoria Schwab's younger works, then this is one not to miss out on. Okay, then we have the Legend of Nightfall series by Miki Sakuraiku. The first book in this series only has about 2,500 ratings, and then the second one only has 745 ratings. Admittedly, the first book has an average rating of 4.04, whereas the second one is only 3.97, so it doesn't quite make the grade for this video, but I have them both, so I wanted to mention them both. So The Legend of Nightfall is this fantasy world where we follow this thief called Nightfall, and there are people in this world who have different magical gifts, but they're treated more as curses, and people try to keep their gifts to themselves, keep it quiet. Nightfall has the ability to change his weight, and he uses that in all sorts of cunning ways in his thievery. However, right at the beginning of the book, he does get caught, and then the king agrees to let him go as long as he will take the prince under his wing and kind of train the prince in the ways of the world. I'm not sure that that's a very realistic plan, but that's what happened. And I think when I read this series initially, I was so impressed with the way that Miki Sakuraiku really used that ability of changing weight. I know in Mistborn Era 2, which I've just read the first book of, there is another character who also has this weight changing ability. So it would be interesting to go back and read this now that I've read that and compare and contrast the two. But if you like books where people have different kinds of magical powers and use them in interesting ways, then this might be one to try. Okay, then we have the Tiger and Dell series by Jennifer Roberson. I have 2-book bind-ups for the first 6 books, and then the 7th book never came in one of those bind-ups. And there is actually an 8th book now, but I didn't like it enough to buy it. Maybe one day I will. But each of the books in this series, I'm only going to hold up this one because honestly, I'm too weak to hold up the rest of them. The first book in this series does have 8,000 ratings, but everyone after that has less than 5,000, and this one only has 884. I will admit, the series does after a while get a little bit pointless, although it is nice that we get to follow these characters right through to when they're kind of older and dealing with parenting and other more grown-up issues. So in the first book, Sword Dancer, we're following this man named Tiger, who's a slave that won his freedom by fighting a sand tiger, and he is now this amazing sword dancer. And then he meets up with Dell. Actually, maybe I don't like this picture. Maybe this is the best picture, or the best cover of the ones that I have. So he meets up with Dell, who is also a sword dancer, or they call them sword singers in the north, where it's all snowy, and that's where she comes from. She comes down to try and track down her brother that's been kidnapped, and then asked Tiger for help. But she is a really amazing sword dancer in her own right. Tiger, however, and pretty much everyone in the south in this big desert, are very sexist. And Dell schools them in why that is ridiculous. And I really like a kind of Tiger's feminist journey, as well as throughout the series he's learning about some magical connections that he might have. I kind of feel like this might have been one of these series that when she started it, she didn't really have a direction in, and sometimes the direction she goes is very intriguing and other times not so much. But the average ratings for the series, even though the number of ratings go down, the average ratings do steadily increase. So I think it's a series worth trying if you want to read about a chauvinistic sword dancer mending his ways. Then we have the Whetū Toa series by Steph Mataku. This is a really cute little series, like a kid's series. It has pictures all the way through it. We're following this girl named Whetū Toa as her and her mother move in with this magician out in like the countryside of New Zealand. They move in with this magician to help him mainly with like keeping his house in order and doing his accounts. But then Whetū Toa also starts looking after the farm animals on this magician's land, and some of the animals are really magical. In this first book, the rabbit, I think, is causing some mischief, rabbit assistant. And then in the second book, there's like this golden ram, and he goes off into like some other dimensions, and Whetū Toa has to go and try and rescue him. They're kind of silly, but always super fun. I think maybe an example of it is one of the farm animals is a chicken, or it's actually like 1,000 chickens, but using maths, they're able to like compress it down to one chicken because obviously that's much more convenient than having 1,000 chickens. So this series is one with the lowest number of ratings of any of the books I have on my list. The first book only has 51 ratings and the second one only 18, but the average ratings are 4.04 and 4.33. That's really high. So if you want like a cute children's story that's really funny, written by a Māori author from New Zealand, these ones are good. Then we have the Galactic Maloo trilogy by Julian May. To be honest, I know these books are from the 90s, but I was shocked to see that they had less than 5,000 ratings, especially when you consider the average rating of them. It starts with 4.19, then 4.22, and 4.24. Those are pretty high ratings. And this series is kind of like X-Men. It's basically like a future where humans have started to develop these psychic abilities, but there's a lot of political conflict going on where some people feel very threatened by these people with psychic abilities, and we're mostly following this particular family. There's a family tree in the front. We're following this particular family where people in the family start being killed off. But we're also following this child, Jack the Bodiless. So he's like a really strong psychic who starts developing his psychic abilities from the womb. Then Diamond Mask ends up being his wife. I can't really remember what happens in Magnificat now, but there's a lot about different psychic powers, but also like this big family saga throughout the generations. I really love this series. This is another one though where I really want to reread it. However, the reread project is not just this trilogy, because this series kind of follows on from the Pliocene Saga. In the Pliocene Saga, we have this thing where they've developed time travel or more. There's like this one particular portal through to like way into the Pliocene era, and they decide to start putting their criminals through there, treating it kind of like as an exile. They're like, well, then they'll be way back in time and they can live out the rest of their lives and die off and not have any impact on anyone else. So we follow a bunch of criminals as they're sent back in time, and they discover that there are some things going on that people weren't aware of, and it starts out like a sci-fi, but it kind of ends up more like a fantasy, although some of these characters that have been sent back in time have psychic abilities like the people in the Galactic Maloo trilogy. And the way it links in is eventually some people who are criminals that are very well known from this series get sent back in time to this time, and they're such like well-known criminals that the people who've been sent back, the other criminals that have been sent back, know who they are. And I just love the way those two series connect together. Honestly, I can never remember which one goes first, but this one goes first. It always seems weird to me. There's also this other kind of series that goes in between, sort of. It's debatable which of those other series comes first. It either goes after or in between, but this is kind of like a first contact series, and I remember reading this during university and just being blown away with the way that the whole alien culture that's introduced worked. So all of those books, amazing. Admittedly, the Pliocene Saga has quite a lot of ratings. This was originally published in the 80s, I think, but the Galactic Maloo, not many ratings. If you've read the Pliocene Saga and you haven't read the Galactic Maloo, you need to fix that. But also, I never see anybody talk about this series, so you're all missing out. Or at least I hope I still think that on my reread. Then lastly, with only 334 ratings, but an average rating of 4.35. Now, I will admit, sometimes I do find books with like very low number of ratings, like most of the ratings will actually be like the author's friends, and so they're being a bit generous. But I feel like 334 is enough to know that it's probably beyond just the author's friends. And also, like, I really like this book, so I think it deserves the high rating. Maybe not quite as high as it's got, but it is an incredibly creative book. So I'm talking about Ki Rangituku by Whiti Hiriaka. So Whiti Hiriaka is a New Zealand Māori author, and in Māori mythology, there is a story of Hatupatu and the Bird Woman, where basically this little shit called Hatupatu eats all the food on this hunting trip and blames it on this other tribe, and then eventually ends up being kidnapped and chased by the Bird Woman, and he hides in different ways. It's a fun little myth, but this story attempts to take Māori mythology, and specifically to tell the story of Kuranga Tuku, the bird woman. But also, this story, you can either start from this side or you can start from this side. Each side has the story starting at a particular point, and from halfway through you can see all the pages. Well, you can't see there. Maybe I'll put in some other footage. You can see the words are upside down because to read those you have to start from the other side. And then right in the middle is like a retelling of the myth of Hatupatu and the bird woman, but you can read it from either direction. So the whole construction of this book is amazing. I personally started on this side, which is more like the night, and this is the day. And this one, the beginning of it was amazing. She meets, what's her name? Hinenui Tupo, who's kind of like the founder of humanity, who then waits in the land of the dead, and she ends up kind of traveling through the different levels of the afterlife and meeting kind of all these different Maori myths and legends. And then this side is more about the beginning of creation. Some parts of this are so absolutely beautiful, and if you're at all interested in Maori mythology, this is a really interesting take on it. I will admit there are some chapters, there's one chapter where it's all written kind of phonetically and it's almost impossible to read, and it was awful to read, to be honest. I hated that chapter. So some parts of this did frustrate me, but other parts were just so beautiful and such an interesting way of thinking about things. This book is an experience, and more people should read it. But also it will only appeal to certain people, possibly quite different people than the books I've talked about in the rest of this video. But if this sounds interesting to you, see if you can get your hands on it. I will admit, these being both by Maori authors might be harder to get your hands on if you're not in New Zealand, but I'll leave a link to the publisher down below in case you want to try. Anyway, those are all the hidden gems on my bookshelves. There are also some books on these shelves that have less than 5,000 ratings and ratings just under 4 stars. So if you'd be interested in hearing about them, let me know. And let me know if you've read any of these books, because I would love to chat with you about them down in the comments. And let me know if there's any hidden gems on your shelves that you don't see people talk about enough. Do subscribe if you'd like to see more of my bookish videos. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you are doing well, and I will see you next time.